I want to talk a little bit about Mito's REST API. So everything that's done in Mito in the UI has a corresponding API. And so we can start to interact with that API in various ways and open up some other ways to automate things inside of Mito. So there is a page in Mito. If you go to /docs, and there's documentation around all this stuff, but /docs shows a page in Mito that is basically it's Swagger documentation. So Swagger is a way to, it basically puts a UI on top of APIs. And so you've probably seen this type of page in other applications if they're using Swagger. But this shows all the various APIs that Mito has. And it also allows you to interact with the API. So this, for example, this is just showing some information about Mito. So we can get some data about Mito. So just, I'm going to try it now and execute here. So what this does is it just sent a request to Mito on Mito's API, and it gave us some data back. So this tells us what version we're on, the URL that we've got in here, what the system info is, tags, etc. So just a bunch of information about Mito. So what I want to show here is one particular API endpoint is related to jobs. And what we're going to do is we're going to run a job, but we're going to do that via the API. So rather than manually clicking start in the UI on a job or setting up a schedule, we're going to start to do this in a more programmatic way. So if we look down here, there's all these different endpoints. So what I'm going to look for here is this one right here. So this is a post request to this API v2 jobs for any particular job ID, and there's an actions path here. So what this allows us to do is send an action to a job. So in this particular case, if I do try it out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a job, but I'm going to do it via the API here. So actually, let me pull this over. All right, so I've got a handful of jobs in here. One in particular is a command job. And what this command job does, it's really fancy. It sleeps for 10 seconds. So it just sends a command to Mito's command line and it says, hey, just sleep. So this job will run for 10 seconds, just allows us to see a job running for a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Mito API here to start job number 12, which is our sleep 10. So I'm just putting in job ID 12 here. We're sending a post request with start. And when I execute this, you'll see over here that that job just started. And it's going to run for 10 seconds and then it'll stop. So what this allows us to do is some interesting things here. So let me kind of go a little bit further. So this is just sort of an introduction to the API. I'll jump back over here. So let's talk about webhooks for a second, and then we're going to combine the webhooks and the API to actually have some jobs start other jobs. So just like every job has a schedule or can be scheduled, every job also has webhooks. So what webhooks allow us to do is to send data or get data from another URL, another API, another website, what have you. And we can do that on certain events that happen inside of Mito. So for example, and the typical use case here that we use a lot is with Slack. So what we'll do is Mito has its own built-in notifications for if you want to get notified via email when a job failed or started or things like that. You can do that in the UI. What we've started doing more and more often though is getting Slack notifications, because we use Slack across our whole business. We've got multiple people that may want to know something's going on in a Mito instance. And so what we do is if there's like a really high priority thing, or if we're testing something or running a new job that may take a while, we'll set up a webhook. And that webhook will send some data to Slack, and then we'll get a notification about it. That's sort of the main use case right now around webhooks. But what I want to talk about is using webhooks to actually start another job. So I've got an example here that we use internally. So let me find this. So this use case here, so this is our production Mito. instance. This use case is for us to keep track of support tickets. So we use Jira for all of our development. We use Jira for support. And what this sequence does is it does a few things. So one, it's got a monitor job. We haven't really talked about monitor jobs yet, but basically this is a SQL query. And when this query returns data, this job will fail. So this query right here is looking at a data model we have from Jira. And it basically says, show me the number of support tickets that were created in the last day and that aren't resolved. And so what happens with this monitor job is that when that criteria is met, when there are actually support tickets that were created in the last day that haven't been closed, this job will fail. So this job is scheduled to run at 8 a.m. every day. And if that criteria is met, the job will fail. So we can look and see today there weren't any support tickets yesterday, they weren't resolved, but 2 days ago there were. And what we do is we use this job and a webhook and the Mito API to start a sequence. And I'll talk to that in just a second. So what this is doing, you'll notice this is the same, this is the V2 jobs with a job ID and actions that we just looked at in the Swagger documentation. So this is posting data to that API endpoint, and it's starting a job when this job fails. So anytime this job fails, again, that's because we have a support ticket that hasn't been resolved in the last 24 hours, it's going to start this sequence. And it actually starts the sequence that the job is sitting in. So a couple interesting things here. One, I just put this monitor job in the sequence so that we know it's related to the sequence. It's not enabled. So this job runs at 8 a.m. When it fails, it kicks off this entire sequence and doesn't run itself. But what it does run is it runs a couple things. So one is a job that exports data to a CSV. So if we look at this is querying that same Jira model table with the same query. So it is saying this is basically give me all the data for any support ticket that was created yesterday but not resolved. And then it outputs to a file. So if we go back to the IO stuff, typically we're loading data into a database. In this case, we want to output data not to a database table, but we want to go from a database to a file. So this creates a file called Zuar Unresolved Support Tickets Yesterday, and it's a CSV file. And so the last little job in the sequence is an email job. So we talked about this briefly at the beginning. So this just takes that file that we just created with the previous job, and this uses one of our inboxes, and it mails this to myself and Andy, who's on our DevOps and support team, and we get this email attachment only on the days where that criteria is met. So just an interesting use case here of not using a normal schedule, but actually using Mito's API and a webhook to fire off a job or a sequence based on some conditions. So a little bit more involved use case there. One thing to note is that sometimes it's hard to know, if you're setting up webhooks, it's a little bit harder to know how things relate. So just be aware of that.